She pressed her frozen fingers against the stranger's door and whispered the most broken words she had ever spoken in her life. "Could I have the scraps? Anything you don't want. Bones, rinds, whatever's left." The man on the other side said nothing for a long moment. Then the door swung open wide, and Wyatt Blackstone, the mountain man, every soul in Crawford County, called dangerous, unhinged, and best left alone, looked down at the starving woman trembling in his doorway and said 4 words she was not prepared for. Get to the fire. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside that cabin will change everything you think you know about kindness, survival, and the kind of love that doesn't ask for anything in return. She pressed her frozen fingers against the stranger's door and whispered the most broken words she had ever spoken in her life. "Could I have the scraps? Anything you don't want. Bones, rinds, whatever's left." The man on the other side said nothing for a long moment. Then the door swung open wide, and Wyatt Blackstone, the mountain man, every soul in Crawford County, called dangerous, unhinged, and best left alone, looked down at the starving woman trembling in his doorway and said 4 words she was not prepared for. Get to the fire. Clara Whitmore had not always been a woman who begged. 3 months earlier, she had been the most reliable bookkeeper in the town of Harlan's Crossing, Montana. She kept the accounts for Crawford Cattle Company with a precision that even Elias Crawford himself had admitted, in a rare moment of honesty, was better than any man he had ever hired. She could find a discrepancy in a ledger the way other women found, dropped pins instinctively, without effort, without having to look twice. Numbers didn't lie to her. Numbers didn't smile at her face and stab at her back. Numbers were the one thing in her world she had always trusted completely. She had arrived in Harlan's Crossing 6 years ago, with nothing but a carpetbag and a letter of reference from a schoolmaster in Missouri who had taught her to read at 9 and watched her devour every arithmetic textbook in his possession by the time she was 12. Her parents were gone. Her brother had died in the war before she was old enough to understand what war meant. She had no family left to return to, no land to claim, and no man willing to stake his name to hers without wanting something ugly in return. So she had come west. She had made herself useful. She had built something small and quiet, and hers. That was before Elias Crawford decided he wanted more than her bookkeeping. It happened on a Tuesday evening in early October, the kind of evening that still held the last warmth of summer in its dying light. Clara had been finishing the quarterly accounts at her small desk in the back office of the Crawford building when she heard the front door open and close. She assumed it was one of the ranch hands dropping off a receipt. She didn't look up from her ledger, Miss Whitmore. She looked up then. Elias Crawford was a large man, not in the way of fat, but in the way of a man who had always occupied more space than he was entitled to and had never once been told to move. He was 52 years old, with iron gray hair and pale blue eyes that had learned to smile without warmth sometime in his 30s. He wore his wealth the way some men wore a weapon, visibly, deliberately, so you would never forget it was there. Mr. Crawford. Clara set down her pen and straightened in her chair. The quarterly accounts are nearly finished. I expect to have them ready by Thursday as agreed. I'm not here about the accounts. He moved into the office without being invited. His eyes moved across the room in a way that made Clara's skin tighten. I'm here to discuss a different kind of arrangement. She kept her voice even. What kind of arrangement? He sat on the edge of her desk, without asking. He looked down at her the way a man looks at something he has already decided to purchase. You're a smart woman, Clara, smarter than most men I employ. I've always appreciated that. But a woman like you living alone, taking in accounts for wages that barely cover your rent, that's a waste. He paused. I have a large house. I have more money than I'll spend in 3 lifetimes. I am proposing that you come live in that house as its mistress. You'll want for nothing. Clara did not move. She felt the words land on her the way cold water lands, with a shock that passes through the whole body before the mind can process it. Mr. Crawford, she said carefully, I believe you are a married man. I am a man with a wife who has been living in her sister's house in Billings for 4 years. He said it without embarrassment. The marriage is finished in everything but paperwork. That is not your concern. With respect, sir, Clara said. And she kept her voice from shaking by sheer force of the stubbornness that had carried her through every hard year of her life. It very much is my concern. As is my reputation, my dignity, and my employment, which I would like to keep on the terms under which it was offered. Crawford's expression didn't change. That was the frightening part, that he simply looked at her, as if her refusal were a mild inconvenience he was already calculating around. Think it over, he said, standing. I'm a patient man. But I am a man who is accustomed to getting what he decides he wants. He left. Clara sat perfectly still for a long time after the door closed. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the quarterly accounts because she did not know what else to do with her hands. She was dismissed the following Monday. The man who informed her, Crawford's foreman, a weasel-faced man named Dobbs, who had always resented that a woman held a position requiring more intelligence than his own, told her that the company had decided to consolidate its accounting needs and her position was no longer necessary. He said it without meeting her eyes. He slid a final envelope of wages across the desk without touching her hand. She took the money and walked out. She found a new ledger position within the week, at Haggerty's Dry Goods, because she was good enough that work found her even when she didn't seek it. Then Haggerty let her go after 2 weeks without explanation. His wife wouldn't meet her eyes at Sunday service. Then the small claims office where she'd done seasonal work closed its books to her without a word of reason given. Then the boarding house where she'd lived for 4 years informed her that her room had been promised to someone else, and she had 2 weeks to find other arrangements. She understood what was happening. She wasn't a fool. Crawford owned the town, not just the cattle, not just the land. He owned the relationships, the loyalties, the quiet arrangements between men that kept things moving the way he wanted them to move. When he decided that Clara Whitmore would be made to feel the cost of her refusal, the town bent itself to his will without him having to say a single word out loud. She tried to leave. She had $62 saved, which was enough to buy passage on the southbound stage to Billings and perhaps secure a room while she found work. But when she arrived at the stage office, the man behind the counter told her, apologetically, that the coach was full. When she asked about the next departure, he told her the schedule had changed. When she tried again 3 days later, she was told the same thing. She understood then that even the stage was not available to her. She wrote a letter to the county marshal. She waited 3 weeks. No reply came. She wrote to a lawyer in Billings whose name she'd copied from a legal notice in the newspaper. His reply was brief. Without witnesses willing to testify, there was nothing that could be done about a man deciding not to employ a woman. And so she walked. She did not decide to walk into the mountains so much as she ran out of other directions to go. The town had sealed itself against her. Every door that might have opened had Crawford's invisible hand pressed flat against it from the other side. When the first snow of the season came in early November, and she was sleeping in a half-collapsed hay barn 3 miles outside of Harlan's Crossing, with her remaining $40 tucked inside her boot, she looked north toward the high country and decided that dying by her own choices in a wild place was better than slowly being crushed to thinning in a town that had decided she didn't exist. She walked for 11 days. The first 3 days were terrible. The next 4 were worse. She ate what she could find: frozen berries, a cache of dried corn she found in an abandoned trapper's shelter, water from streams she had to break ice to reach. She fell twice on icy slopes and once went through a thin crust of snow over a shallow creek and spent an hour shaking uncontrollably before she was warm enough to walk again. She talked to herself when the silence got too heavy. She talked to her mother, who had been dead for 14 years. She talked to the mountains themselves, which did not answer but at least did not judge her. By the 11th day, she had covered more ground than she would have imagined possible for a woman in a torn wool coat with worn boot soles and a body running on very little food. She had also lost her sense of whether any of it was going to matter. She was climbing a rocky slope in the last gray light of a late afternoon, her fingers so cold she could no longer feel them, when she saw smoke rising through the trees ahead. Her first reaction was not relief, it was suspicion. She had learned in the past months to be suspicious of things that looked like help. She stood at the edge of the tree line for a long time, watching the smoke rise, watching the light in the single window of a cabin. She could just barely make out between the dark trunks of the pines. She ran through her options as methodically as she could manage, with a mind that was beginning to blur at the edges, from cold and exhaustion. She could continue along the ridge, but she genuinely did not know if she would last another night in the open. She could turn back down the mountain, which would be a death sentence of a slower kind. Or she could walk up to that cabin and knock on the door, and find out whether whoever was inside was the kind of person who would help her, or the kind who would make things worse. She walked up to the cabin and knocked on the door. She heard movement inside, heavy boots on a wooden floor. The door opened, and she saw him. Wyatt Blackstone was not what she expected, though she could not have said clearly what she had expected. He was somewhere in his late 30s, tall and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who worked hard every day and had done so for years. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw was covered in several days of beard. His eyes were the dark gray of winter sky before a storm, and they were looking at her with an expression she couldn't read, not coldness, not warmth. Just a steady kind of attention that felt like he was actually seeing her, rather than looking through her. He looked at her for a long moment. She knew what he was seeing: a half-frozen woman in a ruined coat, with snow in her hair and desperation written across every line of her face. "Could I have the scraps?" she heard herself say. Her voice was smaller than she intended. "Anything you don't want, bones, rinds, whatever's left." The silence stretched long enough that she began to prepare herself for a refusal. Then he stepped back from the doorway. "Get to the fire," he said. His voice was low and even, like that sound of the wind through canyon rock, not harsh, not gentle, just present. "Then you can tell me who's chasing you." Clara walked inside. The warmth hit her so completely that her legs nearly gave way beneath her. She caught the doorframe, steadied herself, and made herself keep walking until she reached the fireplace, where she stood with her back to the room and her hands held out toward the flames, and let herself breathe for the first time in 11 days. Behind her, she heard him close the door. She heard the sound of a pot being moved, something being set on the table. She heard him move through the space with the practiced economy of a man who knew exactly where everything was and never wasted emotion. "Sit down," he said. She turned and found a chair at the table, and she sat down, and he placed a plate in front of her that made her breath catch in her throat. Elk meat still steaming, roasted root vegetables. A thick slice of bread that had been baked that morning. Tin cup of coffee, black and hot. She stared at the plate. "This isn't scraps," she said. "No," he agreed. He sat across from her with his own plate and picked up his fork. "It ain't. I told you I only needed scraps." He looked at her across the table with those gray storm eyes. "I heard what you said. I'm feeding you what you need, not what you think you deserve." "There's a difference." He nodded at the plate. "Eat before it gets cold." Clara picked up the fork. Her hands were still shaking, but she managed. She ate slowly at first, the way you eat when your body has forgotten what food feels like and needs a moment to remember. Then she ate like a woman who had been walking through the wilderness for 11 days, which is to say she ate everything on the plate and felt no shame about it. When she finished, she looked up to find him watching her with that same unreadable expression. "Thank you," she said. It came out rougher than she intended, scraped raw by everything that had happened since October. He nodded. "You want to tell me what happened," he said, "or you want to sleep first?" She looked at him across the table. She looked at the cabin around her, simple, clean, everything in its place. She looked at the fire, the full shelves, the door that had opened when she knocked. "Who are you?" "Wyatt Blackstone." He said it plainly. "I trap and hunt, live up here year-round. People in town say you're dangerous." Something shifted in his face, but it wasn't what she expected. It wasn't anger or defensiveness. It looked almost like the quiet recognition of something he'd heard before and had long since stopped being surprised by. "People in town say a lot of things about a lot of people," he said. I've noticed that the ones who get called dangerous are usually just the ones who won't do what someone powerful wants them to do. Clara felt those words settle somewhere in her chest like a stone finding the bottom of still water. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "I was the bookkeeper for Crawford Cattle Company in Harlan's Crossing until Elias Crawford decided I was more useful to him in a different capacity." I declined. "He spent the next 6 weeks making sure I couldn't work, couldn't find housing, and couldn't leave the territory." She paused. "I left anyway, on foot. It took me 11 days." Wyatt didn't react with horror or disbelief or the particular kind of sympathy that is really just a form of condescension. He simply listened, with his elbows on the table and his coffee cup between his hands, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. 11 days on foot in November," he said finally. "Up through the high country, yes. You must have a considerable amount of stubbornness." "I have been told," Clara said, "that it is my defining characteristic." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. It changed his face entirely for the half-second it lasted. "Crawford's a powerful man," Wyatt said. "He's had reach into the county marshal's office for at least 4 years. His money bought the judge's second term." He looked at her steadily. "You know that." "I know it now," Clara said. "I knew it less thoroughly in October." "He going to come looking for you?" She thought about it honestly, which was her habit to think about difficult questions honestly, rather than the way she wanted the answers to come out. "I don't know," she said. "He has a great deal of pride. He doesn't like to be told no, but I'm also a bookkeeper with no family and no political influence. The calculation of whether I'm worth the effort of pursuing up a mountain in winter might not come out in favor of pursuit." It might, she agreed. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "You can stay," he said, "until the weather breaks enough for you to get somewhere safe. I've got the room." He nodded toward a narrow door on the far wall. "There's a second room. It latches from the inside." Clara looked at him steadily. "What do you want in return?" His jaw tightened slightly, just slightly, but she saw it. "Nothing," he said. "A person being hungry and cold in a Montana winter is reason enough to open a door." "I don't require payment for that." She studied his face. She was very good at reading faces. It was part of what made her a good bookkeeper, the same attention to the small inconsistencies between what a column of numbers claimed and what it actually showed. She looked at Wyatt Blackstone's face and found no calculation there. No performance, no hidden arrangement being set up behind polite words. She found instead a kind of stillness that she had not seen in a man's face in a very long time, if ever. "All right," she said. He stood, collected the plates, set them in the wash basin. "Get some sleep," he said. "The woodbox in the second room is full. The blankets are adequate. If you need anything, knock twice on the wall." He said it the way you say practical things without ceremony, as if her being there and being cared for was the most natural thing in the world. Clara went into the second room. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the fire in the main room, the wind against the outside walls, the small ordinary sounds of a man moving through his own space at the end of his day. She had not cried in a long time. She had trained herself out of it years ago because crying required a private space, and she had rarely had one, and because the women she had most admired in her life had been women who did what was necessary without falling apart. But sitting in the second room of a mountain man's cabin with a full stomach and 4 solid walls around her for the first time in 11 days, she pressed her fingers hard against her mouth and felt the sob rise up through her chest like something that had been waiting a long time for permission. She let it come, just once quietly with her hand over her mouth. Then she let it go. She pulled the blankets over herself and lay in the dark and listened to the wind and to the fire, and to the silence of the high country in November. And she thought about what it meant that the one place in the territory where someone had opened a door without a price attached was a cabin in the middle of nowhere, belonging to a man that everyone in the valley below called dangerous. She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about Elias Crawford and whether 11 days of walking had put enough distance between herself and his reach. She thought it probably hadn't. She was right. But she did not know that yet. And so she slept deep and dreamless. For the first time in weeks, while outside, the snow fell soft and heavy across the mountain, and the smoke from Wyatt Blackstone's chimney rose into the dark sky. And the wind moved through the high pines the way it always had, and always would, indifferent to the small and desperate lives moving through the wilderness below it. Indifferent to everything except its own cold and restless passage across the world. Morning came gray and still. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, steady and rhythmic like a clock that didn't hurry. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the unfamiliar ceiling above her, to the weight of the blankets, to the absence of the fear that had been her constant companion for the past weeks. It wasn't gone, the fear. It was still there, sitting quiet in the back of her chest where she'd learned to keep it. But it had receded enough that she could breathe around it. She got up, straightened the blankets the way she always did, regardless of circumstances, and opened the door into the main room. Wyatt came in from outside a few minutes later, stamping snow from his boots at the threshold. He looked at her with that same steady attention from the night before, like he was checking to confirm she was still there, and that was all the information he required. "Coffee's on the fire," he said, "biscuits in the pan." She poured herself a cup. She stood at the window and looked out at the snow-covered slope and the dark line of the trees and the blank gray sky. It was beautiful in the way that dangerous things are beautiful, the kind of beauty that doesn't care whether you survive it. "How long have you been up here?" she asked when he came in and sat down. She looked at him. "Alone mostly." He poured his own coffee. "Had a partner the first 2 years. He went back down to the valley." Said the silence was making him crazy. A pause. "I found the silence to be the point." "What were you running from?" She asked it directly because she was tired of dancing around things. He didn't take offense. He looked at his coffee for a moment. "Same thing as most men who end up in the high country," he said. "People who decided they knew what my life ought to look like and weren't interested in hearing otherwise." "Crawford?" "He different men, same type." He looked up. "Crawford's particular variety of it is property. He decides something belongs to him, and then it does, as far as he's concerned. Doesn't matter what the thing thinks about it." "I am not a thing," Clara said. "No," he agreed, "you're not." He said it without inflection, which somehow made it more certain than if he'd made a speech about it. She sat down across from him with her coffee and her biscuit, and they ate in a silence that was, she noticed, not uncomfortable. She was a woman who could tolerate silence. Well, she had spent most of her adult life in the company of her own thoughts and had made peace with the arrangement. But silence with another person was usually either awkward or forced, people filling it with words they didn't mean because empty air seemed to require filling. Wyatt's silence wasn't like that. It was just silence. He was a man who apparently did not feel the need to fill space with sound when sound wasn't necessary. She decided she respected that. "I need to be useful," she said. "While I'm here won't be kept." He glanced at her. "All right. I can cook, clean, repair clothing, manage accounts if you have any, and I learn practical skills quickly. I have never chopped wood, but I'm willing to learn." "Wood chopping takes practice," he said, "but you can learn." Other things, he nodded around the cabin. "I've been doing them alone for 7 years. An extra pair of hands isn't unwelcome." She nodded. "Then we have an arrangement." He looked at her across the table. "We do," he said. And then he looked back at his coffee and she looked out the window and the wind moved in the pines. The fire crackled and outside the snow was still falling. And below them, in the valley of Harlan's Crossing, Elias Crawford was sitting in his office with his pale blue eyes and his cold calculation, deciding whether the bookkeeper who had said no to him was worth the inconvenience of a winter retrieval. Clara didn't know that yet. She only knew the coffee was hot and the biscuits were good, and for the first time in months, no one was asking her to be less than herself. She drank her coffee. She watched the snow fall. And somewhere deep beneath the exhaustion and the fear and the stubborn survival instinct that had carried her 11 days through a Montana winter, something she had believed was dead began, very quietly, to stir. She had told herself she would not become a burden. That was the rule she set for herself that first morning, sitting across from Wyatt Blackstone with her coffee and her biscuit and the snow falling outside the window. She would pull her own weight. She would learn what needed to be learned. She would not ask for more than what was offered, and she would not take up space she hadn't earned. Clara Whitmore had been living by that rule her entire adult life, and it had served her well enough, or at least it had kept her moving forward, which she had always considered close enough to well. The first week in the cabin was harder than she expected, and not for the reasons she anticipated. The cold she could manage. The physical work hauling water, splitting kindling, mending the tears in her own coat with thread and needle Wyatt produced from a tin box, without comment that she could manage too. Her body was tired in a way that went deep into the bone, but it was honest tired. The kind that came from doing rather than from enduring. And there was a dignity in that distinction that she held on to carefully. What was harder was the quiet, not Wyatt's quiet. She had adjusted to that faster than she expected. His silences had a texture to them, not empty, not hostile, just present, like the silence of a room that is comfortable in its own existence. She found she could move through his silences without feeling the need to fill them, which surprised her, because she had always been a woman who used words as tools, sharp and precise, and the absence of them had historically made her uneasy. What was harder was the quiet inside herself. The place where the running had been, where the fear and the calculation and the constant assessment of threat and escape route had lived for 3 months. That place had gone suddenly, startlingly still. And in the stillness, things she hadn't had time to feel began to surface. She felt them mostly at night in the second room with the latch drawn and the fire banked low on the other side of the wall. She felt the particular humiliation of the morning. Dobbs had slid her final wages across the desk without touching her hand, like she was something he didn't want to make contact with. She felt the slow, terrible realization, spread across 6 weeks, that the town she had lived in for 6 years had decided she was less important than Elias Crawford's convenience. She felt the 11 days in the snow, not as a physical memory but as an emotional one, the specific loneliness moving through a wilderness, with no guarantee that anything was waiting on the other side. She didn't cry again. Once had been enough. She processed these things the way she processed difficult ledgers, methodically, without flinching, identifying each line item and placing it where it belonged. Then she set them aside and went to sleep. By the end of the first week she had learned where everything in the cabin was kept. By the end of the second, she had taken over the cooking entirely, not because Wyatt asked her to, but because she found she was better at it than he was. And because having a task to complete each day gave her mornings a shape that felt like forward motion. "You don't have to do all of this," Wyatt said one evening, coming in from the trap line to find the table set and a pot of elk stew on the fire. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want to." She glanced at him. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment with that careful attention that she was beginning to recognize as his version of being moved by something, and then he sat down and ate without further argument. She learned the wood chopping on a Tuesday, the particular stance, the way you had to commit to the swing rather than checking it, the way the wood split cleanest when you aimed for a point just beyond the log rather than at the surface. Wyatt showed her once wordlessly, demonstrating the motion with the axe. Then he stepped back and let her try. She got it wrong 4 times. On the 5th attempt the log split, clean down the center, and she felt a satisfaction so sharp and uncomplicated that it made her laugh out loud, which startled them both. Wyatt looked at her from where he was standing a few feet away. The sound of her laugh seemed to have caught him off guard in a way that nothing else had. "What?" she said. "Nothing." He looked away. "Do the next one." She did the next one, and the one after that. 3 weeks into her stay, Wyatt came back from the eastern trap line with a rabbit in each hand and a look on his face that she had learned to read as something wrong. "Tracks on the lower trail," he said. He set the rabbits on the table and shrugged off his coat. 2 horses. Shod, not trapper. Clara felt the stillness in her chest crack open. "How far down?" she asked. "Day's ride, maybe less if they pushed." He looked at her steadily. "Could be nothing. Could be hunters from the valley cutting north for elk country." "Could be," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She was very good at not letting fear show on her face. She had practiced it extensively over the past 3 months, but she could feel it moving through her, that cold sliding sensation behind the sternum. "I should go," she said. Wyatt was hanging his coat on the peg by the door. He turned and looked at her. Go where? I don't know. Further north. I don't want to bring his reach up here. That isn't fair to you. Wasn't asking about fair, he said. He moved to the fire and held his hands toward it. I was asking where you'd go. It's November in the high country. Where would you go that's safer than here? She didn't have an answer, and they both knew it. Stay, like it was obvious. We don't know yet who those tracks belong to. Could be another week before we know anything. No point in running from a maybe. Clara looked at him. She thought about the difference between charity and practical good sense, and she thought that Wyatt Blackstone seemed to operate almost entirely in the territory of practical good sense, which she respected more than she would have respected charity. Oh, right, she said. The tracks on the lower trail turned out to belong to two brothers named Garrett, who were elk hunters from a ranch outside of Billings, and who passed through the high country every November on their way to their favorite hunting ground further north. Wyatt knew them. They stopped at the cabin for one night, ate Clara's cooking with extravagant appreciation, and departed the following morning with no more knowledge of her situation than when they arrived. But something had shifted. The threat had passed, but its ghost remained, and with it a kind of clarity that hadn't been there before. She lay in the second room that night and understood, with the precision she brought to everything she thought about, that she was not safe. That the mountain had given her a respite, not a solution. That Elias Crawford was down in that valley, and he had a long memory and the kind of pride that did not forget a refusal. She understood something else too, and this understanding was harder to place in a category and file away neatly. She understood that she did not want to leave, not out of fear. Not because she had nowhere to go. She had begun to have somewhere to go, the Garrett brothers had mentioned, in passing, that a surveying company in Billings was hiring anyone with strong arithmetic skills for a westward route project, and they'd given her a name and an address. It was a path forward, a real one. She didn't want to take it yet, and she needed to be honest with herself about why. The reason was Wyatt Blackstone, and what he had done without apparently understanding the magnitude of what he'd done, which was this. He had treated her, from the first moment he opened the door, like a person of full and unqualified worth. Not a woman who needed to prove herself, not a problem to be managed. Not someone whose presence required compensation or explanation or a set of terms. Just a person, capable and adult, entitled to warmth and food and a door that opened. She had not been treated that way, and she tried to remember. She wasn't certain she had ever been treated that way. By her mother, perhaps, but her mother had been dead for 14 years. By her schoolmaster to some degree, but even he had qualified his respect with the implicit condition that she continue to exceed expectations. Wyatt didn't seem to have expectations. He seemed to have simply observed that she was competent and sensible, and she paid attention, and she worked hard, and that those were sufficient qualities for another person, and that was the end of the matter. It was doing something to her. Slowly, quietly, the way the light changes in winter, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, degree by degree, until one day you look up and realize the world is different than it was. She was doing something to him too, though neither of them would have said so out loud. He noticed it first in small things, the way the cabin sounded different with another person in it, not louder, necessarily, but fuller. The way she moved through the space without disturbing it, efficient and purposeful, taking up exactly the room she needed and no more. The way she asked questions about the trap line and the hunting routes and the weather patterns, with the same focused attention she seemed to bring to everything, not making conversation, but actually wanting to know. The way she never made him feel like he needed to explain himself, his silences, his routines, the particular rhythms of a life lived alone in the high country. She simply absorbed them and adapted and did not require commentary. He had not had company in years. He had not missed it, or so he had believed. He was revising that belief quietly, without calling attention to the revision. One evening in the fourth week after supper, she asked him about the ledger she'd found on the shelf near the window. He watched her face when she said it, that particular sharpening of focus that happened when something caught her genuine interest. "It's just accounts," he said. "Supply costs. What I sell and what I spend. May I look at it?" He shrugged and passed it over. She opened it and sat for a moment just reading, not speaking, turning the pages with the careful hands of a woman accustomed to handling documents. Then she looked up. "You're losing money on the beaver pelts," she said. "I know. You're selling them to Hendricks at the trading post." "I am. Hendricks is paying you 60% of market value." Wyatt was quiet. "The market price in Billings for good beaver pelt right now is $3.40, Clara said. Hendricks is paying you $2.05. And you're selling him," she turned a page, ran her finger down a column, 40 to 60 pelts a season. "More or less. That is between 55 and 92 is a year you are handing Hendricks as a gift." She looked up. "Do you know the name of any other traders who operate in this territory?" He stared at her. "You got all of that from 5 minutes with a ledger?" "4 minutes," she said. "And yes." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite something else. "Kellerman," he said, "at the post near Whitehorse Creek. I've sold to him before. What does he pay? $2.50 last I checked. Still under market, but considerably better than Hendricks." She turned another page. "And your supply costs, you're buying cornmeal and salt from the trading post at prices that suggest you haven't compared them to what the general supply wagons charge on their quarterly runs." She looked up again. "I could fix your accounts. If you wanted. It would take me a few days to go through everything thoroughly, but I could tell you exactly where your money is going, and where you could recover some of it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why? Because you fed me a full meal when I asked for scraps," she said. "And that's worth more than a few days of bookkeeping." He was quiet. The fire crackled. "All right," he said. She started on the accounts the next morning. It gave her the same deep satisfaction that good arithmetic always gave her, the satisfaction of order being made from disorder, of numbers that had been sitting in approximate relationship to each other, being pulled into precise alignment. Wyatt's record-keeping was not incompetent. She discovered it was simply the record-keeping of a man who had learned enough to function and had not had reason to go further. She went further. She reorganized the categories, cross-referenced the seasonal patterns, identified 3 additional places where he was paying more than market rate for things he bought regularly. On the 3rd day, she presented him with a summary of her findings, written out in the clear, slanted hand that had served her well across 12 years of professional work. He read it carefully. She watched him read it. "You said bookkeeping," he said finally, without looking up. "I did. This is more than bookkeeping. I have a comprehensive understanding of regional market prices and supply chain economics," she said. "It comes from 6 years of doing accounts for large enough to purchase from 12 different suppliers across 4 counties." She paused. "I am very good at what I do, Mr. Blackstone." He looked up then. His eyes met hers directly, and she saw in them something that she hadn't seen from a man looking at her work in a very long time, if ever. Not surprise. Not the patronizing adjustment men made when a woman turned out to be more capable than they'd expected. Just acknowledgement, clear and uncomplicated. "Yes," he said. "You are." Those 3 words did more damage to the carefully maintained distance she'd been keeping inside herself than anything else that had happened in the past month. She looked at the table and took a breath and said, "I'll have the full report done by tomorrow." "Clara." She looked up. "What Crawford did to you," Wyatt said. And then he stopped, and she could see him working out how to say what he meant without saying more than he intended. "What he did using his money to close every door in town that wasn't about you not being good enough. You understand that?" She looked at him steadily. "I know." "Do you?" "Because I've heard you when you think I can't hear working through it in there at night. Running the numbers on what you could have done different." She felt heat move into her face, which was embarrassing. "I wasn't aware I was audible. Barely. But I've spent 7 years learning to hear things quietly." He looked at her directly. "There was nothing different you could have done. Crawford was going to do what he did regardless. You said no to a powerful man. In his mind that required consequence. That ain't a reflection of your worth. That's a reflection of his." The cabin was very quiet. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "Not saying it to be kind," he said. "Saying it because it's accurate." She almost smiled. "I appreciate the distinction." He did something then that she hadn't expected. He smiled back. A real one. Small and brief, but real, and it changed his face completely. Pulled it out of the weathered seriousness it usually wore. And she saw for a half-second the younger man underneath. The one who had maybe laughed easily once, before whatever had sent him up the mountain. Then it was gone, and he picked up the account ledger, and the moment closed like water over a stone. But it had happened, and Clara, who had very good recall, did not forget it. The 5th week brought the first real blizzard of the season, a 3-day storm that locked them inside the cabin entirely. The wind came down from the north with a violence that made the walls creak and the firefight to hold. She had never been trapped indoors by weather. In quite this way in town there were always errands to invent, always some reason to put on a coat and step outside. Here there was nowhere to go and no pretense of anywhere to go, and so they simply inhabited the same small space for 72 hours. She had expected that to be intolerable. It was not. They talked. Not constantly. Wyatt was not a constant talker, and she was not a woman who needed conversation to feel comfortable, but genuinely, in the unplanned way that conversation happens when two people have nothing to do but be in the same place. He told her about the winters up here, the particular dangers, the strategies for surviving when the snow came hard. She told him about learning to keep accounts, about the schoolmaster in Missouri, about the particular satisfaction of a ledger that balanced to the cent. "What made you leave Missouri?" he asked on the second night of the storm, the question arising from somewhere in the silence between two other things they'd been talking about. "There was nothing left for me there," she said. "After my parents and my brother," she paused. "I knew that I could stay and become someone's poor relation, taking up a corner of someone else's life and being grateful for the corner. Or I could go somewhere where no one knew me and become someone on my own terms." She looked at the fire. "I was not interested in being grateful for a corner." "No, I don't imagine you were." "What about you?" she asked. "What was there before the mountain?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "A ranch, my father's. Then mine. Quarter horse breeding mostly. Good land, good horses. I had a partner friend from the war, or the edge of it. I was too young for the real fighting but old enough for the aftermath. We built the operation together. 4 years." He stopped. "What happened?" "He decided the land was worth more than the partnership." Wyatt's voice was flat, but she could hear the thing underneath the flatness, the old jagged edge of it. "Forged a deed transfer, got a lawyer from Billings to confirm it. By the time I understood what had happened, the legal machinery was already done. I fought it for 2 years, couldn't prove what I knew was true." He looked at the fire. "After the 2nd year, I stopped fighting and came up here." Clara was quiet for a moment. "That's a kind of injustice I understand," she said. "I know you do. Did you ever consider going back, trying again?" He shook his head. "There's nothing to go back for. The ranch isn't mine anymore." He said it simply, without bitterness now, with the absence of bitterness that comes from having processed it fully and set it down. "This is mine. This cabin. These trap lines." A pause. "This is enough." She looked at his profile in the firelight, the set of his jaw, the straightness of his back even sitting still, the way he held himself like a man who had decided what he was worth and did not intend to be argued down from it. She understood that too, she realized, more than she'd understood anything in a long time. "You're not what they said you were," she said. He looked at her. "What did they say?" "Unhinged. A man best left alone." She met his eyes. "I think what they meant was a man who refused to be convenient." The corner of his mouth moved. "That's a generous interpretation." "I'm not a generous person by nature," she said. "I'm a precise person." "That is the precise interpretation." He looked at her for a long moment with those storm gray eyes that had started as unreadable to her and were now, she realized, entirely readable. She simply needed to have spent enough time in the same room with them to learn the language. Then the wind hit the cabin with a sound like a freight train taking a curve, and they both looked toward the wall. And the moment moved sideways into the practicalities of checking the fire and banking it for the night. And neither of them spoke about what had passed between them. But it had passed, and they both knew it. On the morning the storm broke, Wyatt went out to check the cabin's exterior, and the animals he kept a mule and 2 horses in a lean-to structure against the north wall, and Clara stayed inside to start breakfast. She was slicing the last of a side of cured pork when she heard the sound. Not the wind. The wind was gone, exhausted after 3 days. Something else. She set down the knife and moved to the window. Through the frost on the glass, she could see the slope below the cabin, white and blinding in the morning sun. And at the bottom of the slope, at the edge of the tree line, where the trail came up from the valley, she could see 3 figures on horseback. She stood very still. They were not moving. They were simply sitting their horses at the tree line, looking up at the cabin. She watched them for 30 seconds. Then she pulled on her coat and went to the door. Wyatt was coming around the corner of the cabin when she stepped outside. He saw her face and stopped. "What?" he said. "3 riders," she said. At the tree line. He was past her before she finished the sentence, moving to the corner of the cabin where he had a clean sight line down the slope. He stood very still for a moment. Then he came back. His face had changed. Not dramatically. Wyatt Blackstone did not do dramatic, but she could read him now, and what she read was serious. "You know them?" she asked. "One of them," he said. "Man on the right. His name is Virgil Crane. He works for Crawford." The cold that moved through her was not from the air. "He must have spent the storm in the valley waiting for clear weather," Wyatt said. He was already thinking. She could see it, working through the situation with the same methodical practicality he brought to everything. "They're not coming up yet. They're watching, seeing if anyone comes out. Trying to confirm whether you're here before they commit." "Then they don't know for certain," Clara said. "Not yet." "What do we do?" He looked at her then, and for the first time since she'd arrived on his doorstep half frozen and asking for scraps, she saw something in his face that looked like anger. Not the explosive kind, not the kind that Crawford wore. The kind that was really just entitlement dressed up in emotion. This was something quieter and more durable, the kind of anger that lives deep and burns cold and does not run out. "We don't do anything yet," he said. Act normal." "I'm going to go talk to them." "Wyatt, I know this territory," he said it evenly, not harshly. "And Virgil Crane knows that I know it. He's not going to start trouble when I know every rock and draw on this mountain and he doesn't know any of them." He met her eyes. "Trust me." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what trust had cost her in the past. She thought about every person who had said "trust me" and meant trust Crawford, trust the system, trust that things will work out the way powerful men have decided they will work out. Then she thought about the plate of food that hadn't been scraps. She thought about 3 words spoken across a table. "Yes, you are." "Oh, right," she said. He went back inside briefly, came out with his rifle not brandished, just carried, in the way of a man who does not go into uncertain situations without the tools he might need, and walked down the slope toward the tree line. Clara went inside. She did not act normal. She stood at the window where she could see. She watched Wyatt walk down to the 3 riders. She watched the conversation. She couldn't hear words at the distance, only the shapes of an exchange, the body language of men negotiating something. She watched Virgil Crane's horse shift and sidestep. She watched Wyatt stand still, unhurried, his rifle at his side, his posture easy in the way of a man who's entirely comfortable in his position and intends to remain there. The conversation lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then the 3 riders turned their horses and moved back into the tree line and were gone. Wyatt came back up the slope and through the door. He set the rifle by the door and looked at her. "What did he say?" Clara asked. "That Crawford has a legal inquiry into the location of a woman named Clara Whitmore, former employee, who may have stolen documents belonging to the company before leaving." He watched her face. He was careful not to say anything that would sound like a threat. Just an inquiry, just a businessman looking for a missing woman. Just a man following up on potential theft of property. Clara's jaw was tight. "I know. I never took a single document that wasn't mine." She stopped. A thought arrived fully formed, with the sudden cold clarity of something she should have seen earlier. Her eyes sharpened. Wyatt watched her. "The last month I worked for Crawford," she said slowly. Thinking as she spoke, I found discrepancies in the accounts. Large ones, in the records for the northern land acquisitions. She looked at Wyatt. Land transfers. Recorded in the county ledger as legitimate purchases, but the internal records didn't match. The prices were different. The dates were different. The names on the internal receipts were different from the names in the county record. Wyatt was very still. Different how? Different in the way that suggests the county records were changed after the fact, she said. Different in the way that suggests someone Crawford or someone working for Crawford filed altered documents with the county assessor. Land fraud, Wyatt said. At minimum. She felt her mind running through it, the way it ran through a problem ledger, fast, precise, pulling the threads and following them. I didn't take any documents, because at the time I didn't understand what I was seeing. But I remember the numbers, I remember all of them. I always remember numbers. She looked at him. He doesn't know that. He thinks I might have copies of his internal records. That's why he's looking for me, not because I said no to his offer. Because he's afraid of what I might have seen. Wyatt sat down across from her. He placed his hands flat on the table and looked at her steadily. That changes things, he said. Yes, she said. It means he has a reason beyond pride. It means he has a reason that will not go away when I find somewhere else to live, she said. It means that wherever I go, as long as he believes I might have seen something in those records, he'll have someone looking. She felt the reality of it land the way hard truths land, not with shock, but with a kind of grim settling, like a heavy thing finding its level. I'm not just someone who said no to him, I'm a witness. Do you remember enough to be useful? Wyatt asked. To someone. A marshal, a federal land office, anyone with the authority to act on it? She thought about it carefully. Yes, she said, I believe I do. He nodded slowly. He looked at the table for a moment. Then he looked back at her. Then the question isn't how you stay hidden, he said. The question is how you get your information to the right person before Crawford decides hiding isn't enough. The room was very quiet. The sun was coming through the frost on the window now, throwing cold light across the table between them. Clara looked at the light. She thought about 11 days in the snow. She thought about a ledger with discrepancies in the northern land acquisition records. She thought about Elias Crawford sitting in his office in Harlan's Crossing, with his pale blue eyes and his long memory, sending Virgil Crane up a mountain in November with a careful story about stolen documents. She thought about Wyatt Blackstone, who had opened a door and fed her a full meal and told her the truth about her own worth without being asked and without wanting anything for it. She thought about what it meant that she was no longer alone in this. You said you know the territory, she said, every rock and draw. Is there a route that avoids Crawford's reach, that gets to the federal land office in Helena without passing through any county where Crawford has influence? Wyatt thought about it. Takes longer, he said. Week and a half on horseback, maybe 2 weeks with weather. In winter, he paused. It can be done. Not yet, she said. Not until I've written down everything I remember. Every figure, every date, every name. A complete accounting. She looked at him. I need paper and time. And then? Then, he said, we figure out who in Helena can be trusted and how to get it to them without Crawford knowing it's coming. She nodded. She felt something settle in her, not peace, not exactly. But the particular steadiness that comes from having a plan. From knowing what the next thing is and being capable of doing it. She had not felt that since October, and its return was so sharp and welcome that for a moment she had to look away from him, so he wouldn't see what it did to her face. Thank you, she said. Her voice was quiet. For what? For not telling me to stay hidden and wait for it to pass. Every person who's tried to help me in the past 6 months has told me to stay low and be patient and let the thing exhaust itself. She looked back at him. It doesn't exhaust itself. People like Crawford don't run out of patience. They run out of obstacles. I know, he said. I've dealt with people like Crawford before. Something moved across his face, quiet and old. The only way out is through. Clara looked at him. Yes, she said, exactly. Outside, the snow blazed white in the morning sun, and the sky was the hard, brilliant blue that comes after a storm. And below them, in the valley, Virgil Crane and his 2 companions were riding back toward Harlan's Crossing, with a report for Elias Crawford about what they'd found on the mountain. And in the cabin, Clara Whitmore sat down and asked Wyatt for paper, and he produced a stack of it from the shelf near the window, and she picked up a pen and began to write. Numbers, dates, names, land parcel descriptions, transfer amounts. The names of the men whose signatures appeared in the internal records versus the names in the county file. The dates that didn't match. The prices that had been altered. She wrote for 4 hours without stopping, and Wyatt Blackstone sat across the room and did not disturb her and brought her coffee when the cup went empty, and watched her work with an expression on his face that she was not there to see the expression of a man who is watching something he hadn't expected to find, and isn't entirely sure yet what it means, but knows with certainty that it matters. She wrote for 4 hours, and when she finally set down the pen, her hand was cramped, and the stack of paper beside her had become something else entirely, not just numbers and dates, but a weapon. She looked at what she had produced with the same critical eye she brought to any finished piece of work. 12 pages, written in her clear slanted hand. Land parcel numbers and their corresponding entries in both the internal Crawford records and the county assessor's file. Transfer amounts that didn't match. Signatures that appeared in one record and not the other. Dates that had been altered. She knew they'd been altered because she had a memory for sequence, for the way entries built on each other. And the altered dates broke the sequence in ways that were invisible unless you knew what you were looking for. She knew what she was looking for. She had always known what she was looking for. She simply hadn't understood, back in October, that knowing was dangerous. It's done, she said. Wyatt came to the table and she handed him the pages. He read slowly, which she respected. He read the way he did everything, with complete attention, not rushing to the conclusion. When he finished the last page, he set it down and looked at her. This is enough, he said. To interest a federal land agent, yes. To guarantee action, she paused. That depends on how deep Crawford's reach goes and how much the federal office wants the trouble of a case against a Montana cattle baron. The Federal Land Office in Helena operates independently of county patronage, Wyatt said. I know a man there. His name is Samuel Pruitt. He was appointed by Washington 3 years ago, which means Crawford's money didn't put him in his chair. He looked at her steadily. He's honest, or as honest as any government man gets. You trust him? I trust that he wants to make his mark before he rotates back east, and a land fraud case against the biggest cattle operation in Crawford County would make his mark considerably. He paused. Self-interest in the right direction is close enough to honesty for our purposes. Clara almost smiled. That's a very practical philosophy. Practical is what works. She looked at the pages on the table between them. 12 pages that could unravel 4 years of Elias Crawford's careful construction. 12 pages that he was apparently afraid enough of to send men up a mountain in November. How do we get it to Pruitt? She asked. Not through the Postal Service, Wyatt said immediately. Crawford has friends at the Harlan's Crossing Post Office. Anything addressed to the Helena Federal Office from this county gets noticed. He thought for a moment. There's a man named Dutch Calloway who runs a private courier service between the Northern Territories and Helena. He's expensive and he doesn't ask questions. I've used him before for fur contracts. Can you reach him? I can ride to his station in 2 days. 3 with the current snow conditions. He looked at her. Which means I'd be leaving you here alone for somewhere between 4 and 6 days. Clara looked at him directly. I can manage alone for 6 days. That's not my concern. He paused. My concern is Virgil Crane knowing you're here and me being off the mountain when he decides to come back. The room went quiet. She had been thinking about that too, though she hadn't said it. She had been running the calculation since the moment the 3 riders disappeared into the tree line. Crane had reported back to Crawford by now. Crawford was deciding what to do with the information. The calculation on his side was, the woman is there. Blackstone is protecting her. What is the cost of taking her versus the cost of leaving her? A man like Crawford would run those numbers fast. How long before he acts, she said. If he's sending men back up this mountain, he'll want to do it before the deep winter sits in and the high trail becomes impassable. That gives him, Wyatt calculated, 3 weeks. Maybe 4, After that, the trail ices over and it's not practical to move a group of men up it until spring. So we have time. Some, he said, not a lot. She looked at the pages again. Then to Callaway. Get the documents to Pruitt. That's the priority. If those pages reach the federal land office before Crawford's men reach this cabin, we change the nature of the problem entirely. How? Because right now I'm a woman hiding from a powerful man, she said. The moment the federal land office has those pages, I become a witness in an active federal inquiry. Crawford touching me at that point stops being a personal vendetta and becomes obstruction of federal process. She held his gaze. That is a different situation, one that even Elias Crawford's money cannot easily manage. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. She could see him turning it over, testing it for weaknesses. You're certain the numbers hold, he said. If Pruitt looks at those pages, they have to stand up. I have been keeping accounts for 12 years, Clara said. Those numbers hold. Once. Decisive. I'll leave tomorrow morning, he said. I'll take the bay. She handles the snow better than the roan. I'll be back in 5 days or I'll send word, he stood. While I'm gone, you do not open that door for anyone you don't know. The latch is strong, but I'll put an additional brace on it before I go. The rifle is loaded, and there's a second pistol in the chest under the window. I know how to shoot, she said. He looked at her. I know. I've seen you handle the rifle when we were checking the eastern trapline. A pause. You're a better shot than you let on. I didn't let on anything, she said. You never asked. Something moved in his eyes, that thing she had learned to recognize, the thing that looked almost like amusement but was closer to appreciation, the response of a man who genuinely liked being surprised by competence. Fair enough, he said. I'm asking now. My father believed that a woman alone in the world should be able to protect herself, she said. He was right. Wyatt held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, I won't be gone longer than necessary. It was not an elaborate statement. It was not an expression of feeling dressed in practical language, or at least she told herself it wasn't. It was a man telling her the facts of the situation. That was all. She told herself that twice, and then she stopped arguing with herself about it. He left at first light the next morning. She stood in the doorway and watched him take the bear down the slope and into the trees. And then the trees closed around him and he was gone, and the mountain was entirely quiet. And she was alone. She was not afraid of being alone. She had been alone most of her adult life, in one way or another, and had long since made her peace with it. But the cabin felt different, with him absent, not empty exact, but quieter in a specific way, the way a room feels after a conversation has finished. She went through the first day with efficient practicality, completing the tasks she'd assigned herself, checking the brace on the door, keeping the fire steady, reading through her 12 pages one more time to confirm there were no errors. There were none. She hadn't expected any, but she checked anyway. On the second day, she found his other ledgers, the ones from the first years on the mountain, before his record-keeping had become the system she'd reorganized. She read them without guilt, the way you read something that tells you about a person more truly than conversation does. She saw the anger in the early entries, the blunt abbreviated recordings of a man who had reduced his life to its most necessary elements because the unnecessary ones had been used against him. She saw how the anger slowly over years flattened into something more like acceptance. Not contentment. Wyatt Blackstone was not a man who had made peace with everything that had happened to him, but a kind of settled determination. A man who had decided what he was building and had committed to building it without looking back at what had been taken. She understood that impulse entirely. On the third day, the riders came. She heard the horses before she saw them, the sound carried differently in the cold, flattened, and sharp at the same time. She moved to the window with a speed that surprised her, pressed close to the wall beside the frame rather than in front of it, and looked out at the slope. 2 riders, not 3 this time. 2 men coming up the trail from the east, not the main slope using the secondary trail, the one that came up through the narrow draw on the far side of the ridge. The trail that was harder to see from the cabin window. The trail that Virgil Crane would not have known about unless someone had described it to him in detail. Unless someone who knew this mountain had told him. She felt that thought land like ice water. She moved away from the window, keeping her movements quiet, and went to the chest under the main window. She lifted the lid. The pistol was there, a heavy Colt, loaded as Wyatt had said. She picked it up and checked the cylinder, the way her father had taught her, careful, methodical, confirming each chamber. Then she straightened and went back to the wall beside the door and waited. The knock, when it came, was not what she expected. Not a fist, not an aggressive hammering. 3 measured raps, unhurried. "Miss Whitmore." The voice on the other side of the door was unfamiliar. Low, calm, neither threatening nor particularly reassuring. "My name is Thomas Reed. I'm not here for Crawford." "I need to speak with you." She said nothing. She kept her back to the wall. "I know Blackstone isn't here," the voice continued. "I've been watching the trail for 2 days. I waited for him to leave because I need to talk to you without him present, and I want you to understand why before I explain the rest." She assessed the voice. Educated, not local, the flat vowels had a faint Eastern quality, Pennsylvania or Ohio. Controlled. The voice of a man who was choosing his words carefully, which could mean he was trustworthy, or could mean he was practiced at deception. She had met both kinds. "Who's with you?" she said through the door. A pause. "My deputy. He'll wait with the horses. Tell him to move the horses back to the draw and wait there." Another pause. Then she heard a murmured exchange outside, and the sound of horses being moved back down the slope. "Done," the voice said. She looked at the door for a moment. Then she lifted the brace, kept the pistol in her right hand, and opened the door 6 inches. The man on the other side was around 40, with a marshal's badge on his coat that caught the winter light. He had an honest face, or at least a face that had the architecture of honesty, the kind of face that didn't rearrange itself quickly, that showed what it was feeling without much artifice. He looked at the pistol in her hand without flinching. "I'd tell you to put that down," he said, "but under the circumstances you'd be a fool to. And you're clearly not a fool." "No, I'm not. Who are you really?" "Thomas Reed. Deputy United States Marshal out of Helena." He reached inside his coat slowly, watching his hand, and produced a document wallet. He held it out. "My credentials. You can read them through the gap." She took the wallet without opening the door wider. She looked at the documents inside. Federal appointment paper, signed and sealed. A photograph that matched the man on her doorstep with sufficient accuracy. A letter of current assignment. She looked up. "What's your assignment?" "Land fraud investigation in Crawford County," he said. "I've been working it for 8 months. We had a source inside the county assessor's office who gave us enough to open a case, but not enough to close one. We need someone who understands the internal Crawford, records the discrepancies between what was filed with the county and what was actually agreed to in the original transactions." He looked at her steadily. "Someone told us you might be that person. Who told you?" "Federal Land Office, Helena. He received a packet of documents 2 days ago, delivered by private courier. 12 pages in a clear hand. Mr. Pruitt said they were the most complete internal accounting of fraudulent land transfers he had ever seen, and that whoever wrote them understood exactly what they were looking at." He paused. "He sent me to find you." Clara's grip on the pistol did not loosen. Her mind was moving very fast. White had reached Callaway in 2 days. Callaway had delivered the documents in another 2. Pruitt had read them and dispatched a marshal immediately. That was fast. That was very fast. Fast enough that she hadn't expected it. Fast enough that Crawford, who had almost certainly not anticipated the pace of her response, would not have anticipated either. "Come in," she said. She stepped back. Reid came through the door, and she climbed behind him and kept the pistol in her hand, and they stood in Wyatt's cabin and looked at each other with the mutual assessment of 2 people who have been operating in the same dangerous territory from different directions. "You wrote those pages," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did, from memory. I have a strong memory for numbers." He sat down at the table without being invited, which she noted but did not object to. It was the habit of a man accustomed to taking space in difficult conversations. He pulled out a notebook and a pen. "I need you to walk me through each entry. Every discrepancy you remember, the order in which you found them. What the original figures were and what the filed figures showed." "I know what you need," she said. "Before I give it to you, I need to understand the situation." He looked up from his notebook. The situation. Yes. Specifically, how much of this county's legal infrastructure does Crawford own? And what happens to me if he finds out that I am cooperating with a federal inquiry before that inquiry has sufficient weight to protect me? Reed looked at her for a long moment. She could see him deciding how honest to be, and she appreciated that he took time to decide rather than answering immediately with practiced reassurance. The county sheriff is compromised, he said. The county judge almost certainly. The town marshal in Harlan's Crossing is a Crawford appointment in everything but name. He paused. That's the local picture. The federal picture is different. Once you give me a signed statement, you become a federal witness. Crawford has money and local influence. He does not have the power to interfere with a federal witness without consequences that would follow him all the way to Washington. That protection exists once I give you the statement, she said. What about before, while I'm giving it? You're on a mountain in the middle of nowhere, Reed said. Crawford doesn't know I'm here. His men think you're isolated and waiting. Nobody in Harlan's Crossing knows a federal marshal is in this county right now. He held her gaze. We have a window, not a large one, but a window. Clara looked at him. She thought about windows and what it cost to climb through them when the alternative was staying in a burning building. All right, she said. She set the pistol on the table within reach and pulled her stack of pages from the shelf and sat down across from him. We start with the Northern Range acquisitions. 4 parcels, purchased between 1,874 and 1,876. Registered with the county assessor at values significantly below what the internal records show as the actual transaction amounts. Reid opened his notebook. Go ahead, she went ahead. They worked for 3 hours without stopping. Reid was good at his job. He asked questions and he listened to the answers with complete attention. And he did not talk over her or repeat her words back to her, as if confirming that a woman had actually said something coherent. He treated her testimony the way a good professional treats a good source, with respect for the material and no wasted motion. She told him everything she remembered, the parcel numbers and their discrepant valuations. The names that appeared in the internal documents, intermediary buyers, men who had purchased land from Crawford at inflated internal prices and then transferred it to county record at the lower fraudulent values, pocketing the difference. She told him about the 3 signatures she had seen on multiple altered documents that she did not recognize from any legitimate Crawford employee she had encountered in 6 years of keeping his accounts. She told him the dates. She told him the sequence. When she finished, Reid sat back and looked at what he had written. Then he looked at her. You understand, he said, that your testimony puts you in direct opposition to one of the wealthiest men in this territory. That even with federal protection, there will be pressure. People will question your motives, your memory, your character. I understand that, she said. Crawford's lawyers will attempt to establish that you had personal grievances against their client. That your documentation is a fabrication motivated by resentment. Let them attempt it, she said. I have 12 pages of specific verifiable figures. Real land parcel numbers, real transaction amounts, real names. All of it checkable against public county records and against Crawford's internal ledgers, which, if your office secures them before Crawford can alter or destroy them, will confirm every discrepancy I've described. She met his eyes. A fabrication motivated by resentment would not have the internal consistency and specific detail of what I've given you. Anyone who understands accounting will see that. Reid looked at her steadily. You're not afraid, he said. It sounded almost like a question. I'm afraid, she said. I've been afraid since October. Being afraid and acting anyway is not the same as not being afraid. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of respect that had weight to it. Miss Whitmore, he said, I've been a federal marshal for 11 years. I have taken testimony from a significant number of witnesses in a significant number of difficult cases. He paused. I don't say this carelessly. What you have given me today is the most complete and methodically organized witness account I have encountered in 11 years of this work. Clara looked at him. She felt those words move through her the way honest recognition moves, not with the rush of flattery, but with the slower, more durable warmth of being seen accurately. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. He was already reaching for his coat. I need to get back to Helena with this. Once we file the formal inquiry and secure a warrant for Crawford's internal records, the federal protection for you becomes formalized and enforceable. He stood. Until then, the door opened. Wyatt Blackstone walked in, snow on his coat and a rifle in his hand, and stopped when he saw the marshal sitting at his table. The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds, but it had the density of considerably longer. Wyatt's eyes moved from the federal badge to Clara, to the papers on the table, to the pistol she had set beside her, to the marshal standing up from his chair. And she could see him process all of it at once, with the speed of a man who had spent years in situations where fast reading was a survival skill. He looked at her. He's federal, she said. He's legitimate. He received the documents. Wyatt's posture shifted not from threat to relaxed, but from threat to something more like controlled watchfulness. He looked at Reed Marshall. Mr. Blackstone, Reid said. He had not moved, which showed good judgment. Miss Whitmore has been extremely helpful. Your instinct to get those documents to Pruitt was the right one, and the timing was better than you probably knew. How so? Wyatt said. Because Crawford dispatched a second group of men toward this mountain 4 days ago, Reid said. 7 men this time, not Virgil Crane's small inquiry, a serious extraction team. He looked at them both steadily. They're moving slowly because of the snow conditions on the lower trail. My deputy and I passed them yesterday, coming up the eastern approach. They don't know we're here. He paused. But they will reach this cabin in approximately 2 days. The room went very still. Clara felt her mind shift into the cold clarity that arrived whenever a situation became immediately dangerous, not panic, but the opposite of panic, a narrowing of focus to only what was essential and actionable. 2 days, she said, roughly. She looked at Wyatt. He was already thinking she could see it. We can't be here when they arrive, he said. No, Reed agreed. But I can't move Miss Whitmore safely without cover, and I only have 1 deputy. He looked at Wyatt. Your knowledge of this mountain is the variable I don't have. Is there a route out that avoids the main trail, that comes out somewhere other than Harlan's Crossing? Yes, Wyatt said. He didn't hesitate. Takes us north first, then cuts east toward the Yellowstone drainage. Comes out at a settlement called Cutter's Ford. 3 days hard riding in current conditions. Is there a federal presence at Cutter's Ford? Telegraph line, Wyatt said. And a post office that operates under federal charter. That's enough, Reid said. From there I can wire Helena and have additional marshals meet us before we attempt the southward journey. He looked at them both. Can we leave tonight? Clara and Wyatt looked at each other across the table. She saw the question in his eyes, not the obvious one, not are you ready, because he knew the answer to that. The question underneath, the one about what this meant. What coming down off this mountain meant, what moving back into the world meant, what the life they had built in this cabin over the past weeks became once the immediate emergency resolved itself. She looked back at him steadily. She did not look away. We can leave tonight, she said. Wyatt held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded once and moved toward the supply shelves. Start packing what you need, he said. Travel weight only. We take the horses and leave everything else. Clara stood and moved to her room. She packed with the same methodical efficiency she brought to everything. Warmest clothing, her 12 pages of documentation, folded and tucked inside her coat against her body. The money still in her boot. Nothing she didn't absolutely need. She came back out to find Wyatt at the table, writing something on a piece of paper in his spare, abbreviated hand. She watched him fold the paper and tuck it into the pocket of his riding coat. What's that, she said. Letter to Dutch Calloway, he said. Telling him to send word to a man I trust in Billings if he doesn't hear from me in 3 weeks. He met her eyes briefly. In case. He said it simply, the way you say the practical things that need saying when you're riding into uncertain situations. But she understood what was underneath it. It's the same care that had been there since the first night, just wearing different clothes. In case, she agreed. Reid was at the door. We need to move. They moved. The 3 of them went out into the cold mountain dark. Reid, Clara, and Wyatt with the snow crunching under their boots and the stars burning hard and clear overhead, the way they only burn in the high country in winter, too many of them. too bright, like the sky was trying to compensate for something. They brought the horses from the lean-to. Clara mounted the roan, which had decided 3 weeks ago that she was acceptable and now permitted her to manage it without argument. Wyatt took the bay. Reed's deputy, a young man named Jessup, who had been waiting in the draw with more patience than Clara had expected, fell in behind them. They moved north along the ridge, away from the main trail, away from the approach that 7 of Crawford's men were climbing through the dark below them. Clara rode and kept her eyes on the trail, and kept her hand near the pistol at her hip, and kept the 12 pages pressed against her ribs inside her coat, where she could feel them with every breath. Behind her she heard Wyatt's horse moving steady and unhurried, the way he did everything. And below them, on the mountain they were leaving, she thought about the cabin, the fire she had banked for the last time, the second room with the latch on the inside, the table where she had eaten her first real meal in 11 days, and heard 4 words that had begun to rebuild something she hadn't realized had been destroyed. Get to the fire. She thought about those words as the mountain fell away behind her, and the north trail opened up ahead, narrow and dark between the trees. She thought about how much had changed since then. She had arrived on that doorstep with nothing left in her except the stubbornness to keep breathing. She had arrived believing the most she could ask for was bones and rinds and whatever was left over after better people had taken what they were entitled to. She did not believe that anymore. The change had happened slowly, the way the things that matter always happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. Plate of food that wasn't scraps, a ledger examined with genuine respect. A man who said yes you are without needing to be thanked for it. 3 words spoken across a table on a storm-gray morning. The particular quality of a silence that didn't require filling. She had come up the mountain running. She was coming down it with 12 pages of evidence in her coat and a federal marshal at her side, and Wyatt Blackstone's horse, a steady presence 20 feet behind her. And the difference between those 2 versions of herself was not something she could easily articulate, but it was real and it was hers, and no one, not Elias Crawford, not 7 riders on a mountain trail. Not any of the pale-eyed powerful men who had decided she was available for their convenience was going to take it back. She pressed her hand flat against her coat and felt the papers under her palm. She rode north. And behind her, Wyatt Blackstone rode too, steady and close, the way he had been since the moment he opened the door, not leading, not following, but present. There beside her, watching the darkness of the trail ahead with those storm-gray eyes and saying nothing, because nothing needed to be said, because some things are communicated in ways that don't require language. In the steadiness of a presence that does not flinch and does not leave and does not put a price on what it offers. The mountain was behind them now, everything else was ahead. They rode through the night without stopping. The north trail was narrow and punishing in the dark, the kind of trail that required every piece of attention a rider had, and then demanded a little more. Wyatt led because he knew where the ground was solid and where it dropped away under the snow in ways that weren't visible until you were already in trouble. Clara rode behind him, and behind her came Reed, and behind Reed came Jessup, the young deputy who had been patient in the draw and was proving equally patient on a night ride through treacherous mountain country. Nobody talked much. There wasn't breath to spare for talking, and beyond that, the dark had a quality to it that discouraged unnecessary sound, the vast pressing silence of the high country at night, the kind of silence that makes human voices feel presumptuous. Clara focused on the trail. She focused on the roan's movement beneath her, the way the horse rediagrammed better than she did, the small adjustments of balance that told her when the footing changed. She had ridden all her life, but not like this, not in the dark, not in this cold, not with the knowledge that 7 men were somewhere on the mountain below them. She did not think about the 7 men. Thinking about them would not make them fewer or slower. She thought instead about the papers against her ribs, still there, still dry, still carrying every number she had reconstructed from 6 years of careful attention to Elias Crawford's careful dishonesty. An hour before dawn, Wyatt raised his hand and they stopped. "There's a trapper's shelter half a mile ahead," he said quietly. "We rest the horses there for 2 hours. Can't push them through to Cutter's Ford without a break." Raid pulled up beside him. Is the shelter secure? Secure enough. It's off the main line. Crawford's men won't know it's there unless they have someone who knows this mountain as well as I do. A pause. They don't. 2 hours in the shelter. The horses were grateful for it, which Clara could tell from the way the roan pressed her nose against Clara's shoulder when she loosened the cinch and rubbed the animal down with a piece of burlap she found hanging on the wall. She had not grown up around horses. Horses had been a luxury that her family's circumstances didn't accommodate, but she had learned their language quickly in the weeks on the mountain, the vocabulary of ear position and muscle tension and breath. She was learning a lot of languages these days. Jessup slept sitting up against the wall, which was a skill Clara envied. Reed did not sleep. He sat in the corner with his notebook and went through his notes by the light of a small lamp, organizing what she had told him into the structure a federal case required. She watched him work for a while. How many people has Crawford done this to, she said. The land parceled. How Raid looked up. We've identified 9 confirmed fraudulent transfers. We suspect there are more we haven't found yet. He paused. The families who sold those parcels, most of them were small ranchers. Homesteaders, people who needed money and thought they were getting a fair price from a powerful buyer. He looked at his notebook. The recorded price was fair. The price Crawford actually paid them was half that. The difference went into accounts in Billings and Denver under names we're still tracing. Clara absorbed this quietly. 9 families. 9 groups of people who had sat across a table from Elias Crawford's lawyers and believed the number they were being given. Because why would a man of his standing lie about a number when you could check it in the county record? They had checked it. The county record confirmed what the lawyers said. The county record had been altered. He's been doing this for 4 years, she said. At minimum, Raid said. She was quiet for a moment. That's why he reacted so severely when I refused him. It wasn't pride, or not only pride. He needed me. He needed someone who understood accounts and who he controlled completely. A bookkeeper inside the operation who would see the discrepancies and say nothing because she belonged to him. She looked at Raid. When I said no, he didn't just lose a convenience. He lost the person whose silence he had been counting on. Raid looked at her steadily. That is precisely the theory we've been developing for 6 months, he said. And you're the first person to confirm it from inside the operation. Wyatt had been listening from the other side of the shelter, quiet as he always was. He said Crawford's going to know what's coming the moment your office files the formal inquiry. Yes, Raid said. How much time does he have to destroy records? Not much. We'll move simultaneously warrant for the internal records and warrant for his arrest. Both filed the moment we reach Cutter's Ford, and I can wire Helena. And if he runs before the warrant is served. Raid was quiet for a moment. That's a risk, but a man like Crawford doesn't run. He spent 30 years building something. He'll stay and fight it because he can't conceive of losing. He paused. That's our advantage. Clara thought about that, about men who couldn't conceive of losing. About the particular blindness of power, the way it made a man so accustomed to the world bending to his will that he genuinely couldn't see the moment when it stopped bending. She had seen that blindness in Crawford's face the night in the office. He had looked at her with the calm certainty of a man who understood exactly how this would go. She would resist, briefly, and then she would understand the reality of her position, and then she would accept what he was offering. And then everything would proceed according to his plan. He had not been able to imagine a version of this story in which she walked out of that office and kept walking for 11 days through a Montana winter rather than accept his terms. She had walked. Here she was. Get some sleep, Wyatt said to her from across the shelter. Not a command, just a practical observation, offered in the way he offered all practical things out there, with complete confidence that she was capable of deciding whether to take the advice. She slept for 90 minutes and woke feeling sharper than she had in days. They were back on the trail before full light, pushing north through country that became more open as the tree cover thinned. The cold was extraordinary, the kind of cold that gets into your lungs and makes each breath a deliberate act. Clara kept her scarf over her mouth and focused on the rhythm of the roan's movement beneath her and did not think about what was behind them. She thought instead about what Reed had said: 9 families. 9 sets of people who had been defrauded by a system that existed to protect them and had instead been turned against them. She thought about the particular injustice of it, not the dramatic kind of injustice, not the obvious violence, but the quiet kind, the bureaucratic kind, the kind that leaves no marks and is nearly impossible to prove because it hides inside the very documents that are supposed to make transactions honest. She had found it. In a back office in Harlan's Crossing, with nobody asking her to look and nobody expecting her to understand what she was seeing, she had found it. And she had held it in her memory for months without knowing whether it would ever matter. And now it was in Reed's notebook and pressed against her ribs, and moving north through the Montana high country toward a telegraph line that could set the whole thing in motion. It was not nothing. Whatever else happened, it was not nothing. They reached Cutter's Ford at midday on the 3rd day of riding, having pushed hard through the 2nd night to put maximum distance between themselves and the mountain. It was a small settlement, a trading post, a feed station, a handful of structures clustered around the telegraph office that also served as the post office and, in emergencies, the local seat of anything resembling official authority. Reed went directly to the telegraph office. Clara and Wyatt waited outside with the horses and Jessup, who had said very little across 3 days of hard riding and had proven himself useful precisely because of it. Wyatt stood beside the bay and watched the telegraph office door without appearing to watch it, which was a skill Clara had observed in him before, the capacity to be completely alert while seeming simply still. She stood beside the roan and did the same, or tried to. She was not quite as practiced at stillness as he was, but she was learning. "You all right?" he said without looking at her. "Yes," she said. "Then more honestly, ask me again in an hour." The corner of his mouth moved. The telegraph wire went to Helena. Reed was inside for 40 minutes, which was a long time. When he came out, his face carried the particular contained expression of a man who has news of both kinds and is deciding how to present them. "Pruitt filed the formal inquiry this morning," he said. "Warrants are being drawn as we speak. Federal marshals will serve Crawford before nightfall tomorrow." He paused. "There's also a response from the county sheriff's office in Crawford County. Someone we don't yet know who notified Crawford that a federal inquiry was in process." The cold that moved through Clara was not from the air. "He knows," she said. "He knows something," Reed said carefully. "Whether he knows the full scope, the witness testimony, the specific documents, we can't be certain." "What does he do?" Wyatt said. "A man like Crawford, when he finds out a wall is coming." "Usually," Reed said, "he tries to remove what's holding the wall up." He looked at Clara directly when he said it. The silence that followed had weight. Clara felt Wyatt move, not toward her exactly, but adjacent to her, a slight shift in his position. The way a man moves when he is placing himself where he needs to be without calling attention to the placement. She noticed it. She did not comment on it. She felt it the way you feel something that has been consistent and reliable long enough that you have stopped being surprised by it and have started simply counting on it, which is a different thing entirely and considerably more significant. "The marshals in Helena," she said to Reed. "How long before they reach Harlan's Crossing?" "They left this morning. Hard riding. They'll be there by tomorrow evening." "Crawford has tonight and tomorrow morning to act," she said. She was thinking out loud, running the calculation with the same precision she brought to everything. He knows the federal machinery is moving. He knows his internal records are going to be subpoenaed. He knows there's a witness. She paused. The question is whether he decides to run or whether he decides to try to eliminate the problem before the marshals arrive. "He won't run," Wyatt said, flat, certain. Reed looked at him. "You sound sure." "I am sure. I've known men like Crawford." "Not the same man, but the same type. They don't run because running means admitting the game is lost, and they cannot admit that. They push harder. They make the problem worse." He looked at Reed steadily. "He's going to do something tonight. Something that he believes will solve this cleanly and quickly enough that by the time your marshals arrive tomorrow, the evidence is gone and the witness is unavailable." The word unavailable sat in the cold air between them. Jessup, who had been quiet as usual, spoke for the first time in hours. "We should move her," he said, "not stay in Cutter's Ford tonight." Clara said. "There's a federal way station 14 miles east," Raid said. He was already thinking it through. She could see it. Used by marshals on circuit. It's on record as a federal facility, which means any act of violence against persons sheltering there is an automatic federal offense on top of whatever else Crawford's already facing. He looked at her. "It's not comfortable, but it's defensible." "I'm not concerned with comfort," Clara said. "No," Raid said. I've noticed that." They restocked at the trading post food, ammunition, fresh water, and moved east within the hour. Clara noticed Wyatt speaking briefly with the man behind the trading post counter before they left, too quietly for her to hear. When he came back out and mounted the bay, she looked at him. "What did you tell him?" she said. "Asked him to send a wire to Dutch Calloway. Told him the letter in his pocket from me is outdated and to disregard the instructions." He met her eyes briefly. "Calloway was supposed to word to Billings if he didn't hear from me in 3 weeks. I didn't want him sending unnecessary alarm to people who don't need to be involved." She looked at him for a moment. "You thought of that?" "I try to think of things." She thought about the letter he had written at the table before they left the cabin. The quiet preparation of a man who understood that uncertain situations required advanced planning, who did not catastrophize, but who also did not pretend that everything was going to be simple. She thought about the particular combination of practicality and care that had characterized every action he had taken since the night he opened the door. And she thought that she had been right, back in those first weeks, when she'd decided that the most important thing Wyatt Blackstone had given her was not the food and not the shelter, but the experience of being treated as someone whose well-being was worth planning for. Not out of obligation.
Not out of calculation.
Just because it was the right thing, and he was a man who did the right thing without requiring an audience for it. She rode east beside him and did not say any of this, because there was not a clear language for it yet. But she held it the way she held important things carefully. Aware of its value, not rushing toward it. The Federal Way station was exactly as Reed had described, not comfortable, but solid. A single-story structure built to withstand weather and serve as shelter for men who traveled long distances in difficult conditions. It had a heavy door and shuttered windows and a fireplace, and enough room for 5 people and their horses, the latter accommodated in an attached structure that shared one wall with the main building. They settled in. Raid and Jessup took the first watch. Clara sat near the fire and went through her documentation one more time, the 12 pages, now worn soft at the fold lines from being carried against her body for 4 days. She read each page with the same critical attention she'd given them when she wrote them, looking for any weakness, any number she wasn't certain of. She was certain of all of them. Wyatt sat across from her and watched her work, the way he had watched her work at his table in the cabin. And she was aware of him watching in the way she had become aware of all his presences, as something that was simply part of the space she occupied now, like the sound of a fire or the weight of a roof overhead. "After this," he said. She looked up. "After this is finished," he said. "The case. The Crawford." He paused, choosing words with care. "What do you want?" She looked at him steadily. The question was larger than it appeared. It was not only about practical plans. She understood that, and she could tell from the way he had asked it that he understood it too. That they were having 2 conversations simultaneously in the way that people sometimes do when they have spent enough time in the same silence to know each other's frequencies. "I want to see this through to the end," she said. "The testimony, the case. I want to stand in front of whatever court or federal proceeding requires it and say what I know on the record where it counts." She paused. After that, she looked at the fire. "I've thought about the surveying company in Billings. The one the Garrett brothers mentioned. They need someone who understands numbers and regional land values." She looked back at him. "It would be honest work, good work." "Billings," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a long way from the mountain." "I know. 3 days hard riding. I know, Wyatt." He looked at the fire. She looked at him, looking at the fire, at the set of his jaw and the stillness he wore like a second coat, and she felt something move through her that was warm and complicated, and entirely inconvenient given the current circumstances, which involved a federal protection situation and 7 men somewhere behind them in the mountains. "You could come to Billings," she said. She said it carefully, precisely, the way she said things she meant. Not an invitation dressed up as a casual observation. Not a question wrapped in plausible deniability. A clear statement of a thing she meant. He looked at her. "I have trap lines," he said. "I know. And a cabino that I built myself, Wyatt." She held his gaze. "I know. I'm not asking you to abandon it. I'm saying that Billings is 3 days hard riding, which means it is also 3 days hard riding back. I'm saying that a man who knows the Northern Territories and understands supply and logistics and regional market pricing would not be without options in a city that is actively expanding its commercial infrastructure." She paused. "I'm saying that 7 years is a long time to be alone because someone hurt you once, and that the mountain was the right answer at the time, and maybe it isn't the only answer anymore." The fire crackled. Wyatt was quiet for a long time. She let him be quiet. She was good at that. "You're a very direct woman," he said finally. "I've found it saves considerable time." He looked at her across the fire with those storm-gray eyes that she had learned to read, as well as she read a ledger now, all the entries visible, nothing hidden, the final total honest. "I'll think about it," he said. "That's all I asked," she said. It was not all she'd asked, but it was enough for now, and they both knew it. The night passed without incident, which was either because Crawford had not yet made his move, or because his move was being made somewhere else entirely. Clara slept in 2-hour intervals, waking for her share of the watch, standing at the shuttered window with the pistol in her hand and listening to the silence outside. Both times her watch passed without anything to report. The telegram arrived in the morning. Reed came in from the small communications relay that the way station maintained a wire connection to the nearest telegraph line 2 miles north, with a piece of paper in his hand, and an expression that Clara could not immediately categorize. "The marshals reached Harlan's Crossing last night," he said. "Warrant served on Crawford at approximately 9 o'clock yesterday evening." He looked at the paper. "Crawford's lawyer appeared within the hour and posted bond. He's not in custody, but his offices have been sealed and his records are under federal hold." "He's free," Clara said. "Temporarily. The records hold is what matters. He can't destroy the internal ledgers now without it being an additional federal offense with witnesses." Reed looked at her. "There's more. Crawford's foreman, a man named Dobbs." Clara's jaw tightened at the name. "Presented himself to the county marshal's office this morning with a sworn statement. He is claiming that you approached Crawford's office in the weeks before your departure and offered to falsify the company's accounts in exchange for money. That Crawford refused, and that you fabricated the discrepancies as retaliation." Reed watched her face carefully. "He has 2 other signatures on a supporting affidavit. Men from the Crawford payroll." The room was very still. Clara felt the anger arrive not hot but cold, which was the kind that lasted. Dobbs, the weasel-faced man who had slid her final wages across the desk without touching her hand. The man who had resented her for 6 years for being better at her job than he would ever be at his. Of course it was Dobbs. Crawford would have gone to Dobbs first, because Dobbs had a grievance against her that predated Crawford's instructions and would sound, to the right audience, like personal conviction rather than purchased testimony. "That's his strategy," she said. Her voice was even. "Discredit the witness before the witness can testify. Turn it into a competing set of sworn statements, his people against me, and hope that a jury or a federal examiner decides the truth is somewhere in the middle and therefore uncertain." "Yes, it won't work," she said. He looked at her carefully. "What makes you certain?" "Because competing statements are a matter of word against word," she said. "What I have is not word against word. What I have is 12 pages of specific, verifiable figures, parcel numbers, transaction amounts, dates, all of which can be cross-referenced against public county records and against Crawford's internal ledgers, which are now under federal hold and cannot be altered." She looked at Reed steadily. "Dobbs can swear anything he likes. The numbers don't care what Dobbs swears. The numbers are what they are." Reed held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned to Jessup, wire Helena. Tell Pruitt to begin the cross-reference analysis immediately. Public county records against the internal ledgers. He looked back at Clara. And I need your full testimony transcribed into a formal, sworn statement today, while we're here and it's fresh. I'm ready when you are, she said. Wyatt, who had been standing near the door through all of this, said, There's something you haven't said. Raid looked at him. Dobbs filing that's this morning, Wyatt said. Crawford's people moving fast, moving organized. That means Crawford was ready. He had this prepared before the marshals knocked on his door last night. He looked at Reed evenly. Which means he knew the inquiry was coming before the warrant was served. He had time to prepare a countermove. He paused. You said someone notified Crawford that a federal inquiry was in process. You said you didn't know who. That's correct, Reed said carefully. You need to know, Wyatt said. Because if Crawford has someone in the federal communication chain who tipped him yesterday, that same someone can tell him where we are right now. The silence that came after that was the kind that rearranges a room. Reed's face did something complicated. She could see him working through it, the marshal's instinct to defend the integrity of his office, running directly into the investigator's obligation to follow the evidence wherever it went, even when it went somewhere uncomfortable. My wire to Helena this morning, he said slowly, routed through Cutter's Ford. And Cutter's Ford, Wyatt said, is a small settlement where 7 men on horseback would be very noticeable if they had arrived there looking for information about a federal marshal's movements. Reed was already moving toward the door, but it was Jessup who came through it first, from outside, with his hand on his sidearm and his young face pulled into something older and more serious than she had yet seen on it. 3 riders, he said, coming up the eastern approach. Not Crawford's extraction team, wrong direction. But they're moving fast and they're not trying to hide their approach. Everyone looked at everyone else for exactly 1 second. Then Wyatt said, back window. Now we don't run, Reid said sharply. We don't run, Wyatt agreed. We move to a position where we're not sitting in a box with 1 door. He was already crossing the room. There's a difference. Clara was right behind him. She had the pistol in her hand and the 12 pages against her ribs and every nerve in her body pulled to full attention. But underneath the tension there was something else, a clarity, a strange and powerful steadiness. The feeling of a woman who has run as far as she can run and has decided somewhere in the past 3 days of hard riding and the past months of being pushed that she is done being pushed. She had the evidence. She had the federal witness testimony. She had the truth of 12 years of careful, honest work standing behind every number on every one of those pages. Let them come. She stood beside Wyatt at the back of the way station and listened to the sound of horses stopping outside the front, and she breathed steadily, and she kept her hand firm on the pistol grip, and she waited. Reid's voice came from the front of the station, sharp and authoritative, federal marshal. Identify yourselves, a pause. Then a voice she didn't recognize, muffled by the wall. Deputy Marshal Harrison, Helena office. We were sent by Samuel Pruitt. Another pause, longer this time, while Reed verified. Then Reid's voice again, different now, the tension gone out of it. Stand down. They're ours. Clara lowered the pistol slowly. Beside her, Wyatt let out a breath so controlled it was almost silent. She looked at him. He looked at her. Pruitt sent backup, she said. Apparently Pruitt is not entirely predictable, Wyatt said. That's the best thing I've heard in days, she said. He looked at her for 1 long moment. Something moved in his face that was too large to fit inside his usual containment. She could see it pressing against the edges of the stillness he wore. Something that had been building for weeks and had not yet found its form but was very close now, very close to becoming words. Then Reed was at the door of the back room, 3 additional marshals. Pruitt wired them when he saw Reed's report last night. They'll escort us to Helena. He looked at them both. We move in an hour. Wyatt held her gaze for 1 more moment. Then he nodded once and turned to prepare the horses, and the moment moved sideways into the business of survival and forward motion, the way all their moments had practical and necessary and still carrying. Underneath everything that had not yet been said. She followed him outside to where the horses waited. She placed her hand briefly on his arm as she passed him just briefly, just for a second, and felt him go still under the touch. She didn't look back. She went to the roan and began to check the cinch, methodical and focused, and behind her she heard him resume moving, and the horses breathed their warm breath into the cold air. And an hour later they were riding east toward Helena with 3 federal marshals around them, and the 12 pages still pressed flat against her ribs, still warm. Still holding every number she had ever trusted to do what numbers do when handled honestly. Tell the truth. They rode into Helena on a Thursday morning, 5 federal marshals and 2 civilians arriving at the federal building on the main street before the town had fully woken to its day. Clara had not been in a city in 3 months. The sounds hit her differently than she expected: wagon wheels on packed dirt, voices carrying across open space. The particular dense human noise of a place where many people occupied a small area, and none of them were pretending to be quiet about it. She had grown so accustomed to the mountain silence that civilization felt, briefly, like something she needed to readjust to. The way your eyes need a moment when you come in from bright light. She readjusted quickly, she always did. Samuel Pruitt met them in the lobby of the federal building. He was a small man with a precise manner and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, the kind of man who took up less physical space than his authority warranted, which Clara had always found to be a reliable indicator of genuine competence. Competent people rarely needed to perform their competence for the room. He shook Reed's hand. He looked at Clara and said without preamble, "Miss Whitmore, your documentation is the most precisely executed evidence of internal accounting fraud I have seen in 14 years of federal land work. You have my complete respect." Clara looked at him steadily. "I want Elias Crawford to answer for what he did to 9 families," she said. "Your respect is appreciated, but that is what I want." Pruitt's eyes sharpened further, which she took as approval. "Then let's get to work," he said. The next 4 days were the hardest kind of hard, not the physical hard of 11 days in the snow, not the cold fear of riders on a mountain trail, but the grinding procedural hard of turning what she knew into what the law could use. She sat in a room with Pruitt and Reed and a court stenographer, and she gave her testimony in full, beginning from her first discovery of the discrepancies in the Northern Range acquisition records, and moving through every figure, every date, every name with the same methodical precision she had applied to her 12 pages. They went through it twice, then a third time because Pruitt wanted to be certain that her account was consistent across repetitions and could not be attacked as rehearsed or reconstructed after the fact. It was consistent. She had not invented any of it. Memory does not drift when what it holds is true. Crawford's lawyers appeared on the second day, which was fast even by the standards of men with money and the ability to summon professionals across large distances quickly. There were 3 of them, from a firm in Billings that Clara recognized from the firm's letterhead, which had appeared on several of Crawford's legitimate land transactions in the years she'd worked for him. They were good. They made their arguments with the polished efficiency of men who had practiced those arguments in front of a mirror and knew exactly which words landed hardest. They argued that her testimony was motivated by personal grievance. They argued that her documentation was reconstructed from faulty memory. They argued that Dobbs's affidavit and its 2 supporting signatures represented equally valid testimony from witnesses with direct knowledge of Crawford's business operations, and that the federal office had no basis for preferring her account over theirs. They were making the argument she had predicted to Reed at the way station. The middle-of-the-road argument. The truth is uncertain argument. Pruitt listened to them without expression. Then he placed on the table between them a stack of documents 2 inches thick, Crawford's internal ledgers, secured under federal hold the night the warrant was served, and he said, in the flat tone of a man who has done his homework and is not interested in performing surprise about what it contains, the cross-reference analysis of Miss Whitmore's testimony against the secured internal records shows a concordance rate of 94% across all figures cited. The remaining 6% represents entries that could not be confirmed due to record gaps. I will note, in the sections of the ledger that appear to have been subject to recent physical alteration before the seal was placed. He looked at the 3 lawyers across the table. Would your clients care to explain the gaps? The room was quiet for a moment. Then the lead lawyer said, "We'll need to consult with Mr. Crawford. Take all the time you need," Pruitt said pleasantly. "The warrant doesn't expire." Clara was in the hallway outside when the lawyers came out. She was standing with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention to it, and she watched the three lawyers pass without looking at her. Moving with the brisk, wounded dignity of men who had just discovered that the wall they'd been planning to walk through was more solid than their client had led them to believe. She thought about Dobbs. She thought about the two men who had put their names on a supporting affidavit, swearing that Clara Whitmore had tried to sell Crawford a fabrication. She wondered if they had understood what they were signing, or whether they had simply done what Crawford's money asked them to do without examining it closely. She found she had room for both possibilities. Men like Dobbs acted from resentment. Other men acted from necessity. Understanding why something happens doesn't make it right, but it makes it human, and she had always preferred to see things as they were, rather than as she wished they were. Wyatt was waiting in the lobby when she came back downstairs. He had been restless in Helena in a way she recognized from their third week on the mountain, when the snow had trapped them inside, and his body had needed movement that wasn't available. He was not built for lobbies and procedural waiting. He was built for the North Trail and the trap line and the particular purposefulness of a life where the work is direct and the results are visible. He looked up when she came down the stairs and read her face with the accuracy he had developed over 2 months of learning her frequencies. "Good," he said. "The lawyers are consulting with their client," she said. "Which means the internal records confirmed what I said, and they're trying to figure out how to proceed." She sat down in the chair beside him. "It's good," he nodded. They sat for a moment in their particular kind of quiet. "You've been outside," she said. Not a question. She could tell by the cold still in his coat. "Twice," he said. "The city doesn't sit still." "No," she said. "It doesn't." She looked at him. "How long are you planning to stay?" He looked at her sidelong. "Until this is finished." "Wyatt, you have a cabin and trap lines and a mule that needs feeding." "Dutch Calloway's nephew is watching the animals," he said. "I made arrangements before we left." She absorbed this. He had made arrangements. Before they left the mountain, in the middle of everything, the riders and the documents, and the night departure, and 3 days of hard riding, he had thought about the mule and made arrangements. She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "I wasn't leaving until I knew you were safe," he said. Simply, the way he said things he meant, that's all. She held his gaze. There was more in those words than their surface meaning, and they both knew it. And for once she did not reach immediately for precision and directness, did not lay the thing out, with the clarity she normally brought to everything she meant. She simply let it sit between them the way the fire had sat between them in the cabin, warm, present, doing its work without requiring explanation. On the 5th day, Crawford's lawyers returned without the polished confidence of their first appearance. They sat across from Pruitt and Reed and Clara, and they made, in the careful language of men who are negotiating a controlled retreat, a proposal. Crawford would acknowledge administrative irregularities in his land transfer documentation. He would establish a restitution fund for the affected families. He would cooperate with the federal inquiry going forward. He would not plead to fraud. Pruitt looked at the proposal. Then he looked at Clara. She looked back at him steadily. She thought about the 9 families. She thought about what administrative irregularities meant as a category of wrongdoing, how small it sounded, how insufficient. She thought about what cooperation going forward meant for a man who had demonstrated, across 4 years of systematic fraud and 6 weeks of deliberately destroying one woman's livelihood and sending men up a mountain in November, that his relationship to consequence was transactional and conditional. "No," she said. Pruitt looked at her. "Miss Whitmore, I should advise you that a negotiated settlement." "No," she said again, with the same quietness and the same absolute certainty. Those families sold their land believing they were being given a fair price. Elias Crawford used the county records to lie to them, and he used my silence, the silence he assumed he'd purchased by making me dependent on his employ to protect that lie. Administrative irregularities is not what that is. Administrative irregularities is what you call it when a clerk files something on the wrong date. She looked at the lawyers across the table. What Crawford did has a name. It should be called by that name in a federal record. The families it was done to deserve to have it called by its name. The silence in the room lasted long enough to become something. Then the federal office will continue to pursue the original charges. He looked at the lawyers. Your client has 72 hours to reconsider his position. Crawford reconsidered in 48. He did not do so with grace. There was nothing graceful about Elias Crawford's capitulation. It had the quality of something being pulled apart under force, resisted to the last, yielding only because the alternative had become impossible. He pled to 5 counts of federal land fraud. The administrative settlement was rejected. The restitution fund was established by court order rather than voluntary action, which meant it was larger and better supervised than what his lawyers had offered. Dobbs's affidavit was dismissed as uncorroborated testimony contradicted by physical documentary evidence. The 2 men who had signed the supporting statement were given the opportunity to revise their accounts in light of the corroborating ledger evidence. One of them did. His revised account confirmed everything Clara had said. She heard about this from Raid on a gray Tuesday morning in Pruitt's offices. He told her plainly, with the directness she had come to appreciate in him, no softening, no drama, just the facts in the order they mattered. When he finished, she sat for a moment and let it settle. The 9 families, she said. The restitution, is it sufficient? It won't give them back the years, Raid said honestly. But it's real money, properly calculated against what they were actually owed. Several of them will be able to reclaim their land. Others will have enough to start over. He paused. Because of what you gave us. She looked at the window. She thought about what it would feel like to be one of those families to have sold a piece of land you'd broken your back to work, believing you were getting fair value, not knowing that the fair value was a number someone had invented for a county record. To have lived for years with that transaction sitting in the back of your mind as a legitimate thing, a square deal, not knowing that you had been stolen from. To find out now that it hadn't been square, that it had been a crime, and that the crime was going to be called a crime in a federal proceeding. It wouldn't fix everything, it never did. But it was true, which was the most important thing she knew how to offer anything. Good, she said. She went to find Wyatt. He was as she had expected. Outside, standing in the narrow alley beside the federal building, where the city noise was slightly less overwhelming, his coat collar turned up against the December cold. Looking at the sky the way a man looks at something familiar when everything around him is unfamiliar. She came and stood beside him. It's done, she said. He looked at her. Crawford pled to 5 counts. The restitution fund is ordered by the court. The families will be compensated. She looked up at the same piece of sky he'd been looking at. It's done. He was quiet for a moment. You did that, he said. Pruitt's office did it, she said. Reed did it. The legal machinery did it, Clara. His voice was quiet and firm in the way it was when he was not interested in argument about the matter at hand. You did that. You walked 11 days through a Montana winter, and you held those numbers in your head for months, and you sat in that room and said clearly, and did not let them move you off what you knew was true. He looked at her directly. You did that. She looked at him. She felt the thing that moved through her when he said things with that particular plainness, the thing she had stopped arguing with herself about weeks ago. We did it, you opened the door. That was easy, he said. What you did wasn't easy. She held his gaze for a moment. The December sky was low and white overhead, the kind of sky that holds snow and hasn't decided yet whether to let it go. Then she said, because she was a direct woman and she had decided that some things deserved to be said directly, I want you to come to Billings. I know, he said. I'm not asking you to give up the mountain. Or the trap lines. She looked at him. I'm asking you to consider that a man who knows this territory and understands what land is worth and can navigate supply routes through the high country in winter might find that his skills have value. In Billings as well as on the mountain. She paused. And I'm asking you to consider that 2 days' ride is not an impassable distance. 2 days hard riding, he said, 3 with weather. You've done worse. He looked at her with something in his eyes that she recognized now fully, and without the hedging she'd applied to it in the early weeks, the look of a man who has been alone long enough that the return of something good feels almost dangerous. The particular caution of someone who has learned that what you value can be taken and has spent years making sure he didn't value anything that could be reached by someone else's hands. She had learned that caution too, in her own way. She understood it from the inside. "I'm not going anywhere," she said quietly. "I'm not Crawford. I'm not your partner who forged a deed. I'm a woman who walked 11 days in the snow and sat in a federal hearing room for 5 days and said what was true because it was true. And I am telling you now, on the same basis, that I would like you to be in Billings." She held his gaze. "That's all. No hidden terms, no cost on the back end." He was quiet for a long time. The alley was cold and the city moved and made noise around them, and neither of them looked away. "I need to go back to the mountain first," he said finally. "Check the animals. Close the cabin properly for winter." "Of course," she said. "That's maybe 3. "I'll be in Billings by then," she said. "I wrote to the surveying company yesterday. They wired back this morning. They want me to start as soon as I arrive." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, and not quite something else, but was in the territory between them, warm and certain. "You wired them before you asked me," he said. "I knew what my answer was," she said. "I needed to know yours." He reached out then, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything, and his hand found hers where it hung at her side, and his fingers closed around hers with a grip that was firm and warm and careful all at once. The grip of a man who has decided that this is something worth holding and intends to hold it properly. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, she agreed. He held her hand for a moment longer in that cold alley in Helena, and neither of them said anything else, because nothing else was required. She arrived in Billings on a Wednesday in late December, with a carpetbag and $62, not the same $62 she had carried out of Harlan's Crossing, but the same amount, which felt like a kind of deliberate return to a starting point, from which she now intended to move differently. She had a letter of employment from the surveying company. She had secured a room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Halverson, who was sensible and warm and asked no unnecessary questions, which Clara considered an excellent basis for a domestic arrangement. The work was exactly what she had hoped. The surveying company was mapping route options for westward commercial expansion. And they needed someone who understood land values and regional pricing and could translate the mathematical reality of terrain into figures that the company's eastern investors could read and trust. She understood that work completely. She did it well. Within 2 weeks, she had reorganized their filing system, identified 3 errors in their current root cost projections, and been offered a permanent position with a salary that was, she noted with satisfaction, 20% higher than what Crawford had paid her. She accepted. She wrote to Wyatt every few days. Not long letters. She was not, by nature, a writer of long letters. She communicated precisely and without excess in all her written forms. But real letters, with real content, what she was working on, what Billings looked like at this time of year, what Mrs. Halverson had served for Sunday dinner, what the surveying company's chief engineer had said when she corrected his topographical cost estimate by $400 and was proven right when they checked it against the field survey. Wyatt's letters back were shorter than hers. But they came reliably, and they were honest. The mountain, the trap lines, the state of the cabin after its weeks of sitting in winter, the mule's opinion of the weather. A brief and characteristically understated account of his visit to Kellerman's trading post to renegotiate his pelt prices along the lines she had recommended, which had resulted in a significantly improved rate. The 3rd week of January, she received a letter that was 2 sentences longer than his usual. He would be in Billings by Thursday. He had spoken with a man named Calder who ran a regional supply operation and was looking for someone who knew the Northern Territory routes well enough to plan efficient runs. They were meeting on Friday. He did not know yet if it would come to anything, but the conversation seemed worth having. She read that letter 3 times, not because it was difficult to understand, but because she wanted to read it 3 times. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon as promised. She was at the office when he came to the door. She knew it was him before she saw him. From the way the clerk at the front desk looked up with the particular expression of someone encountering a presence they were not entirely sure how to categorize. She came out from behind her desk and she walked to the front of the office, and there he was, standing in the doorway in his traveling coat with the cold still on him and those storm-gray eyes finding her face with the same directness they always had, that quality of actually seeing rather than looking through. "You're here," she said. "Thursday," he said, as agreed. She looked at him. He looked at her. The clerk at the front desk was carefully studying the surface of his own desk, with the concentration of a man who understands that some moments belong to the people in them. "The meeting with Calder is tomorrow," she said. "Yes. Do you want to tell me what you're hoping for from it?" He considered. "Honest work," he said. "That uses what I know. That doesn't require me to be something I'm not." He held her gaze. "Same as you. Same as me," she agreed. She picked up her coat from the hook by the door. "Mrs. Halverson keeps a good table," she said. "And she doesn't ask unnecessary questions." She pulled on her coat and buttoned it. "Come to supper." He held the door for her. She walked through it. They walked out into the January evening together, the cold clear air of Billings carrying the distant sound of the city doing what cities do, living, moving, making itself from the accumulated effort of the people in it, and above it all the same enormous sky that had been above the mountain. The same sky that had covered 11 days of walking in the snow, and 3 days of hard riding through the high country, and 5 days in a federal hearing room. Indifferent and vast and wide enough to hold whatever a person was willing to become inside it. Clara Whitmore walked through that evening with her head up and her stride sure, and the surveying company's letter of permanent employment in the desk drawer back at the office. And beside her walked the man who had opened a door in a mountain winter and fed her a full meal when she had asked for bones. And she thought about what that act had cost him nothing, and what it had given her everything. And she thought that this was the most important thing she had learned across the whole long arc of the past months. Not that kindness is rare, though it is. Not that good men exist, though they do. But this, that the moment someone treats you as a person of full worth, when you have spent enough time being treated as less, it doesn't just feel good. It reminds you of something true that you had forgotten. And once you remember it, you do not forget it again. The meeting with Calder went well. Wyatt did not offer this information dramatically. He told her at supper on Friday evening with the same directness he brought to everything. Calder was expanding his northern supply routes and needed someone who knew the high country passes and could plan runs that the standard operators considered impassable. He had offered Wyatt a contract position, flexible enough to allow him to maintain the mountain cabin and the trap lines during the prime trapping season. "Will you take it?" she asked. He said. She looked at him across Mrs. Halverson's supper table. The lamplight was warm. The food was good. Outside, Billings went about its evening. "Still mine," he said. "I'll go back in the fall." "Trap season. And the rest of the year?" He looked at her steadily. "Here," he said, "if that's still what you want." She held his gaze. She thought about what it had taken to arrive at this table, the refusal in October, the 6 weeks of being slowly crushed, the 11 days in the snow, the cabin and the warmth and the meal that wasn't scraps, the 12 pages of numbers. The federal hearing room, the cold alley in Helena where he had held her hand. She thought about all of it, and she felt it not as a burden but as the price of something she had earned, fair and square, paid in full. "Yes, it's still what I want." He nodded. He picked up his fork. He ate. Mrs. Halverson brought more bread without being asked, because she was that kind of woman, and the evening moved around them warm and ordinary and exactly, precisely, entirely enough. In the spring, word came from Reed that the Crawford case had completed its federal review. The 5 counts were confirmed. The restitution payments had reached all 9 families. 3 of them had used the money to reclaim their original land. The county assessor's office had been restructured under federal oversight. The county judge, whose second term Crawford's money had bought, declined to seek a third. Dobbs, the letter noted at the end, had left Crawford County in February. His whereabouts were unknown. Clara read that line and set the letter down and did not spend another moment thinking about Dobbs. She wrote back to Riad with her thanks and the straightforward professional warmth she had developed for him across their weeks of working together. She told him that the surveying company had promoted her to senior accounts analyst, a position that had not existed before she created the need for it. She told him that Billings was on consideration an adequate city. She told him that things were well. Things were well. On a Friday evening in April, Wyatt came to meet her after her workday ended, and they walked together through the lengthening evening light, the kind of spring light that makes the world look like it's deciding to be something. And he reached over without ceremony and took her hand the same way he had in that cold alley in Helena, firm and warm and careful, and held it while they walked. She looked at him. He looked ahead at the street in the evening and the wide Montana sky above the rooftops. Adequate city, she almost laughed. You read my letter to Raid. It was on the deck, it was sealed. The seal was inadequate. He glanced at her sideways. The ghost of a smile, the one that changed his face. Adequate city. She looked at him. She felt everything she had felt on every cold morning and hard ride and quiet evening of the past months, and she felt it not as separate things but as one thing, continuous and real and hers. The company across the street from ours, she said, is looking for someone to plan their northern supply routes. I mentioned to the owner that I knew a man. Wyatt looked at her. I may have spoken highly of you, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. The evening moved around them, alive and ordinary and full. Is that so? Said. I am very precise, she said. I don't overstate things. He looked ahead again. He was quiet in the way of a man who is smiling on the inside and sees no reason to make a production of it. They walked on. The woman who had knocked on a stranger's door in a Montana winter and asked for bones had found something she had not known she was looking for. Not shelter, not safety, not rescue. But the simple and extraordinary experience of being seen as she was, valued as she was, met exactly where she stood, and the discovery, made slowly and honestly across the hardest months of her life, that she had been worth that all along. She had never needed anyone to give her a place at the table. She had only needed someone to remind her she was allowed to pull up a chair, and she had done the rest herself.